Hello everyone. Today I'm going to share a short case study about inclusive assessment and how assessment design can sometimes unintentionally create barriers for students. The story focuses on a student named Maya and will use her experience to think about how assessment practices connect to equity and social justice in education. Before we begin, I want to ask you a quick question. Have you ever seen a student who clearly understood something during class activities, but then performed poorly on tests? Type A for yes, B for occasionally, C for rarely, or D for never in the chat. Most teachers have experienced this at some point. Today's case study looks at one example of how that can happen. So let me introduce you to Mia. I'm going to play a short video that tells her story. While you watch, think about what might be happening with assessment. Now that you've seen Maya's story, I'm curious about your first reaction. What stood out to you? Type one word in the chat. You might be thinking things like reading difficulty, assessment design, or fairness. This reaction helps us start identifying the assessment issues within this case. In this case, there are actually several assessment issues happening at once. First, the chorus relies heavily on multiple choice tests. Second, the questions are long and complex, which means reading ability becomes a big factor. Third, the assessment doesn't provide any alternative ways for students to demonstrate what they know. So even though Maya understands the coding concepts, the assessment format is making it difficult for her to show that understanding. Let's try a question similar to the kind Maya might see on her test. Take a look at this question and type the letter you think is correct in the chat. The correct answer is B, a step-by-step process used to solve a problem. For many students, this question is manageable, but watch what happens when the wording becomes more complex. Now take a moment to read this version. Did that feel harder to understand? Type yes or no in the chat. Even though the concept hasn't changed, the language becomes the barrier, and this is similar to the challenge Maya experienced. So this brings us to an important question. What was the assessment actually measuring? Was it coding knowledge, reading comprehension, test-taking skill, or all the above? Often in cases like this, the answer is all of the above. That means the assessment may not be measuring the learning goal as clearly as intended. Research on inclusive assessment suggests that assessments can unintentionally create barriers for some learners. For example, an assessment might be intended to measure subject knowledge, but it may also measure other skills like reading speed, language proficiency, or test-taking strategies. When this happens, the assessment may not accurately represent what the student actually understands. Research on inclusive education also highlights that inclusion is not simply about placing students in regular classrooms. Whitley and Holweck explain that being physically present in a classroom does not automatically mean students are fully included in learning. Toll argues that education systems can maintain barriers even when policies promote inclusion. In other words, the structures of schooling, including assessment practices, can still create inequitable outcomes. Universal Design for Learning offers one way to address these issues. Universal Design for Learning recognizes that learners vary in how they understand information and demonstrate knowledge. Instead of designing assessments for a single typical learner, UDL encourages educators to provide multiple ways for students to show what they know. For example, students might demonstrate learning through projects, presentations, or practical demonstrations rather than only written tests. When we apply these research ideas to Maya's case, we can see how assessment designs created a barrier. The test relied heavily on reading complex questions and choosing answers quickly. This meant that reading ability and test-taking skills influenced the result more than actual coding knowledge and what the course was meant to assess. As a result, the assessment did not accurately represent Maya's understanding. There are a few frameworks to help us understand this situation. Universal Design for Learning encourages educators to plan for learning variability from the beginning and provide multiple ways for students to demonstrate their understanding. Ableism reminds us that education systems sometimes assume a standard learner, and deficit thinking occurs when we assume the problem is the student rather than questioning the structure of the assessment itself. So let's pause for a moment. Where do you think the main issue lies in this case? Is it the student, the assessment design, the curriculum, or the teacher? Type your answer in the chat. This question helps us think critically about how assessment practices influence student outcomes. There are several possible ways a teacher could respond to this situation. One option is to keep the assessment format unchanged. Another is to provide accommodations to individual students. A third option is to redesign the assessment to allow multiple ways for students to demonstrate their learning. From an inclusive assessment perspective, the third option often provides the most equitable approach. Based on inclusive assessment research, several recommendations emerge. Teachers can reduce reliance on reading heavy testing formats. They can provide multiple ways for students to demonstrate learning, such as projects, demonstrations, or explanations. And they can review assessment questions to ensure that the language complexity does not create unnecessary barriers. It is also important to recognize that this case is not unique to Maya. Many students experience similar challenges, including students with learning disabilities, multi-language learners, or students who process information differently. This means assessment design has broader implications for equity in education. To close, I'd like to leave you with two questions. The first one, when does an assessment stop measuring knowledge and start measuring unrelated skills? And second, should assessments be redesigned from the start to reduce barriers rather than relying on accommodations after problems appear? I would love to hear your thoughts. And as a final thought, sometimes the problem isn't the student. Sometimes the problem is the assessment. Thank you for watching.